The General's face changed the moment he saw the pendant around my neck. We were standing in the middle of a field debrief, dust still on our boots, the kind of post-exercise gathering where everyone is tired but pretending not to be. Folding tables had been set up near the tree line, and junior officers were passing around water bottles and half-eaten energy bars. General James Hargrove had been moving through the group the way senior officers always do at these things, shaking hands, nodding at briefings, projecting the kind of calm authority that fills a room without effort. I was not planning to speak to him. I had nothing to report that required his attention. Then he stopped. He was 3 feet away from me when it happened. His eyes, which had been scanning the group with practiced ease, dropped to my chest and went still, not the way eyes go still when something is familiar. The way they go still when something is impossible. He did not look at my rank. He did not look at my face. He looked at the pendant hanging just below the collar of my uniform, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. It was a small thing. Copper, worn smooth in places, shaped roughly like a dog tag but slightly narrower. On the front was an eagle in mid-flight, its wings pressed back as if diving. On the back, a short row of numbers and a small symbol I had never been able to identify. It had belonged to my grandfather. I had started wearing it 3 weeks ago, after the funeral, and I had not taken it off since. The General's jaw tightened. He took one slow step forward. "Where did you get that?" he said. His voice was low, not commanding, not conversational. Something between the two, the kind of tone a man uses when he already suspects the answer, but is not yet ready to believe it. "It was my grandfather, S," I said. "He passed away last month." The general looked up at me then. His expression was not what I expected. It was not curiosity. It was not skepticism. It was something older than both of those things, something that had been sitting inside him for a long time waiting to surface. "What was his name?" he asked. "Robert Mitchell," I said. "Bobby Mitchell." The general was quiet for 3 full seconds. Around us, the debrief continued. Someone laughed at something near the water table. A radio crackled. The world kept moving exactly as it had been, indifferent to the fact that something had just shifted in the air between me and this man I had met 40 minutes ago. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "Not here." And that was the moment I understood that my grandfather, the man my own family had spent decades dismissing as a disappointment, might not have been who any of us thought he was. Robert Mitchell was the quietest man I ever knew. He lived alone in a small wood-frame house on the edge of Harlan County, Tennessee, the kind of town that appears on maps but rarely in conversations. The house sat back from the road, hidden by overgrown hedges and a pair of old oak trees whose roots had long since cracked the front walkway. He drove the same rusted blue pickup truck for as long as I could remember. He kept a vegetable garden in the backyard that he tended carefully each summer. He had a dog named Chester, a slow, moving hound mix who slept on the porch and required very little from the world, which suited them both. Grandpa Bobby was not a man who took up space. He spoke when spoken to. He ate whatever was put in front of him without complaint. He watched the evening news and went to bed early and never once, not in all the years I knew him, talked about Vietnam. There were small signs, if you knew to look. A scar running along his left forearm that he explained away as a farming accident when I was 7 years old. The way he always sat with his back to a wall in restaurants, eyes moving toward the door without appearing to. The fact that he never attended 4th of July fireworks, not once, though he never explained why. And the pendant which he wore every single day of his life, which he touched sometimes in the middle of a conversation, as if reassuring himself it was still there. I asked him about it once when I was 15. We were sitting on the porch in the late afternoon, watching Chester chase something slow through the tall grass at the edge of the yard. "What does that mean?" I asked, pointing to the pendant. He turned it over in his fingers for a moment before answering. "It reminds me of the men who did not come home," he said. That was all. He did not elaborate. I did not push. That was the understanding we had, Grandpa Bobby and I. I never asked for more than he was ready to give, and in return he always gave me something, even if it was small. Most people in the family did not operate that way. My father, whose name was also Robert, but who went by Rob to distinguish himself, had been born in 1958 and raised in the same Harlan County house, and had spent most of his adult life trying to become something visibly different from his origins. He was a regional sales manager for a medical supply company, which sounds modest but had given him a good car, a clean office, a firm handshake, and a way of entering rooms that suggested he belonged in them. He measured people by what they had constructed in the visible world. By that standard, his own father was not a success. "He lives like someone who gave up," my father said once when I was in high school, driving back from a visit that had lasted less than 2 hours. He chose that life. He could have done something with himself after the war. Plenty of men did. My mother was more careful in how she expressed it, but she arrived at the same destination. She felt sorry for Grandpa Bobby, the way you feel sorry for someone who has been dealt a difficult hand and played it poorly. She brought him casseroles twice a year, on his birthday and sometime around Thanksgiving. And she called occasionally on Sunday afternoons. And she considered that sufficient attention for a man who never asked for more. "He never complains," she said once, in a tone that managed to make this sound like a character flaw rather than a virtue. "He just exists out there." It is very hard to know how to help someone who will not tell you what they need. What he needed, I thought even then, was for someone to show up. Not with casseroles, just to show up and sit with him and be there. But I was a teenager, and then a young adult, and then a Marine Corps officer with her own deployments and assignments and forward momentum, and I told myself that I visited more than anyone else, which was true, and I told myself that was enough, which was not. My brother Daniel was 7 years older than me and had settled in Charlotte, which put convenient geographical distance between himself and any obligation to feel guilty about not visiting Harlan County. He had a wife and 2 children, and a job in commercial real estate, and a busy schedule he referenced often. At a Thanksgiving gathering when he was in his late 20s, he made a joke about how Grandpa Bobby's greatest accomplishment was having a garden that had never been featured in any magazine. And everyone laughed, in the slightly uncomfortable way families laugh at things that are partly true. Grandpa Bobby was sitting right there at the table. He smiled politely. I watched something behind his eyes go very carefully and completely quiet. I used to find reasons to stay at the table with him after the rest of the family had drifted away. We would sit together over cold coffee while the others watched football or washed dishes or stood on the front porch talking about things that mattered to them. He never thanked me for staying. He never commented on the fact that I was the only one who did. We would just sit there in a comfortable silence that felt more honest than most of the conversations happening in the other rooms. I joined the Marine Corps at 22. Partly because I believed in service and partly, if I am being truthful, because I had grown up watching a man who had served and I wanted to understand something about what that cost. I wanted to know the thing he would not explain. Grandpa Bobby said nothing dramatic when I told him. He nodded slowly the way he nodded when something confirmed a theory he had been developing for a long time. "You have the right temperament for it," he said. "You do not panic when things go wrong and you do not need a crowd telling you that you did well. Those are the things that matter." That was the most complete assessment of my character anyone had ever given me, and it came from the man my family considered to have nothing useful to say. I was stationed at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, 3 years into my second tour as a company officer. When the call came, it was a Thursday evening in late October. The number on my screen was not one I recognized. It belonged to a woman named Edna Colwell, who lived 2 houses down from Grandpa Bobby and had his emergency contact information, because no one in the family had thought to update it in the past decade. She told me he had collapsed in his kitchen that morning. Paramedics had taken him to the county hospital. She had tried calling my parents first. She said she had left messages. The careful way she said it told me the messages had not been returned with any urgency. I requested emergency leave that same night and drove through the dark for 4 hours with the radio off, and my hands steady on the wheel and something in my chest that I recognized from deployments. The kind of controlled dread that comes when you know something is already decided, and you are simply moving toward it. When I arrived at the hospital, the duty nurse told me I was the first family member to appear. Grandpa Bobby was in a room at the end of the second-floor corridor, connected to monitors looking smaller than I had ever seen him look. The overhead light was off and a single bedside lamp was on, and in that light he looked very old and very alone in a way that made me feel the distance between Lejeune and Harlan County as something physical. A weight I had not been carrying properly. He opened his eyes when I came in. He looked at me for a long moment without speaking, the way you look at something you thought you might not see again. "You came," he said finally. His voice was thinner than I remembered. Of course I came, I told him. He nodded slowly. I thought he might say something else, but he just reached out and held my hand, and we sat like that for a while without talking. And for once in my life I did not feel the need to fill the silence. I called my parents from the hospital hallway that first night. My mother said she had a work commitment Thursday and Friday that she could not move and that she was sure he would stabilize. The doctors are very good at these things, and she would see about getting up there by the weekend. My father said he would try to arrange something. He was in the middle of a quarterly review. He would let me know. My brother sent a text message 20 minutes after I spoke to my father. Keep me updated, it said, with no punctuation, which told me he had written it on his phone without slowing down. No one asked how serious it was. No one asked if he was conscious. No one asked what he needed. No one came. I sat in that hospital for 4 days. Grandpa Bobby was not always conscious, and when he was not always fully clear. The doctors told me his heart had been weakening for 2 years and that he had apparently declined to mention this to anyone or seek treatment beyond the minimum. He had known something was coming and had chosen to meet it quietly and alone, which was, I thought, entirely consistent with everything else he had done. There was one afternoon, the second day, when he looked at me with full recognition and spoke with complete clarity for about 20 minutes. He said he wanted me to know that he did not regret the choices he had made, even the ones that cost him. He said he had spent his life trying to ensure that certain things he had been part of did not damage the people around him, and he hoped he had managed that. He said, I think maybe I forgot to let anyone in while I was protecting everyone out. He closed his eyes after that and did not say anything meaningful again. He passed away on a Sunday morning in the quiet hours before the hospital fully woke up. A nurse came in gently and a doctor appeared shortly after and said the words they say, and I sat beside the bed for a while longer because I was not ready to begin the next part yet. The funeral was small. A local pastor who had known him slightly, a handful of neighbors, Edna Colwell, who cried with the full commitment of someone who had known him for 30 years and paid attention, an elderly man in a veteran's cap who stood in the back throughout the service and left before I could reach him. My parents attended, arriving 40 minutes after the service began, and leaving while people were still gathered at the grave. My mother said she needed to be home before dark, which was true in the logistical sense. My brother sent a flower arrangement with a card that said in loving memory, as if it had been ordered from a form. I stood at the grave and listened to the dirt and felt something settle inside my chest that was neither grief nor anger exactly. It was more like the long-delayed arrival of a recognition I should have come to sooner. After the service, I went back to his house. My parents had already begun discussions with a realtor. There were practical considerations, they said. The property would need to be cleared out. The sooner that process began, the better for everyone. I asked for 2 days in the house before any decisions were finalized. My mother agreed with the expression of someone granting an appeal that is slightly tiresome, but not worth refusing. The house smelled like him, strong coffee and old wood and something faintly like motor oil from the garage. I moved through the room slowly, not looking for anything, just being present in the space where he had lived for 30 odd years. Most of what I found was ordinary. Clothes worn to softness through regular use. A shelf of Louis L. Amour paperbacks with cracked spines and pages bent at the corners. A toolbox in the garage organized, with a precision that seemed to belong to a different life than the one visible in the rest of the house. A kitchen drawer full of rubber bands and twist ties and batteries he had kept, in case they still had some charge left, which struck me as the most Bobby Mitchell thing I had ever seen. In the bedroom on the top shelf of the closet, behind a stack of folded flannel shirts, I found a small cardboard box. It was not locked, it was not hidden exactly, just placed there with a kind of deliberate quiet, like something set aside carefully rather than concealed. Inside was a folded American flag, the kind given at military funerals. A black and white photograph of a group of young men in fatigues standing in front of a helicopter, grinning at something off. Camera with the particular ease of people who do not yet know what is coming. A single sheet of paper with a column of names written in careful handwriting. Each name followed by a short number. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a square of soft flannel, the pendant. I recognized it immediately. I had seen it around his neck my entire life. Holding it was different. The copper was heavier than I expected. The eagle on the front was precise, almost formally rendered. On the back, 11 numbers arranged in a single row, and below them a small symbol that looked almost like a compass rose but not quite. Something between a star and a wheel, with a deliberateness to its lines that told me it had been put there intentionally. I did not know what any of it meant. I only knew that this object had meant something enormous to the man who wore it every day for 50 years. I wrapped it back in the flannel and put it in my pocket. My parents did not ask about it when I spoke to them that evening. My parents did not ask about anything in the house. The realtor had already sent a preliminary valuation. I drove back to base and put the pendant on and did not take it off. The exercise had been running for 2 days when it ended. A combined arms coordination drill across a coastal terrain that left everyone short on sleep and long on accumulated dust. The debrief that followed was standard procedure, unit commanders cycling through after action assessments, while senior evaluators observed and took notes. General Hargrove was present as a visiting evaluator from a different command, at our installation for a week as part of a broader review of training protocols in the division. I had been introduced to him briefly the previous day. He had the manner of someone who had seen a great deal and found most of what he saw merely adequate. I had not thought about the pendant when I dressed that morning. It had become as automatic as my dog tags, as unremarkable as my boots. It sat against my sternum under my uniform. And during the debrief it had shifted on its chain, and the top of the chain was visible above my collar in the afternoon heat. That was how he saw it. After he said we need to talk, he found a lieutenant to manage the remaining debrief logistics, and walked me to a quiet stretch of ground behind the command vehicle, away from the tables and the water bottles, and the casual noise of 30 people wrapping up a long exercise. He stood with his hands behind his back, looking at the pendant where it rested against my chest, with the expression I now recognize as the one people use when they are deciding how much of what they know to say. "Can I see it?" he asked. I lifted it from my neck and held it out. He took it carefully, the way you handle something that has history in it. He turned it over slowly. When he saw the numbers on the back, he went completely still in a way that was different from his earlier stillness. This was not recognition. This was something more personal than that. He looked up at me. "There were 11 names on that list," he said, very quietly. "These are their service numbers." I did not know what to say. He handed it back. "I need you to come to my office tomorrow morning," he said. "What I have to tell you cannot be said quickly, and this is not the right place for it." I drove to the installation where he was quartered the following morning, signed in at the gate, and was escorted to a small conference room by a young aide who offered coffee and then closed the door behind him. The general was already seated at a plain table. In front of him was a manila folder he did not open immediately. He waited until I had sat down, and then he looked at me for a moment before speaking. The way people look when they are deciding how to begin something they have been carrying for a very long time. He asked me what I knew about my grandfather's service. I told him everything I had, which was almost nothing. Discharge papers indicating he had served in the army. A notation that he had deployed to Vietnam in 1967. Beyond that, silence. The general nodded as if this was exactly what he had expected. Then he told me about November of 1967. He told me about a place called Hill 875 near the town of Dak To in the central highlands of Vietnam, and about the battle that had taken place there over 4 days involving elements of the 173rd Airborne Brigade. He told me it was one of the costliest engagements American forces had fought in the entire war, the kind of battle that enters the official record and stays there. But he was not there to tell me about the main battle. He was there to tell me about something that happened on the perimeter of it, something smaller and less recorded, involving a 12-man reconnaissance team that had been inserted ahead of the main force to assess enemy positions and provide intelligence for the assault. "Your grandfather was the team sergeant," he said. He was 29 years old. The general had been 23 at the time, a second lieutenant on his first deployment, attached to the team for the mission. He described what happened with the precision of someone who has gone over it many times, in his mind if not aloud. The team had moved into position without incident. The intelligence collection had proceeded as planned. The problem came during extraction, when they discovered their egress route had been cut by an enemy force that had repositioned overnight. Their radio had been damaged in a fall during movement. They were 12 men in dense highland terrain with no communication and no clean way out. Bobby Mitchell spent 20 minutes studying the terrain and the enemy positions, talking to no one, just looking. Then he gathered the team and told them what was going to happen. There was one viable corridor through the enemy position. A narrow saddle on the north side of a ridgeline that the North Vietnamese had not yet fully covered. The team could move through it, not all at once and not without someone holding the approach point to prevent the corridor from being closed behind them while they moved. He told the 11 men to go. He set up a position at the approach point with a machine gun and what ammunition they could pool from the group. He told them he would hold as long as he could and that they should not wait for him at the extraction point. He held that position for 40 minutes, the general said. Alone. 3 separate attempts to close the corridor. He turned all 3 of them. The 11 men made it out. Every one of them. Bobby Mitchell was captured during the withdrawal from his position. He spent 7 months in a prisoner of war camp in the north before being released in a prisoner exchange in the spring of 1968. He came home, was discharged, received a perfunctory debriefing, and filed no paperwork requesting commendation or recognition. The mission itself was classified because it was connected to an intelligence operation the Army did not acknowledge. The official record showed only that Robert Mitchell had served and been discharged, which was accurate in the narrowest possible sense. By the time portions of the relevant records were partially declassified in the late 1990s, attempts to locate Bobby Mitchell had found him at an address he no longer used. Subsequent efforts had not produced contact. We tried to find him, the general said. I tried personally, more than once. He had moved, he had not left forwarding information. I do not believe he was deliberately avoiding contact. I think he had simply decided to live in a way that did not involve being found. He paused and looked at the folder on the table. The pendant, he continued, was the team's own creation. Before the mission, your grandfather organized the making of 12 pendants, one for each member of the team. The eagle was a symbol the unit had adopted informally. The numbers on the back were the service numbers of the other 11 men, inscribed at your grandfather's specific request. He told the team that if anything happened to him and the pendant survived, whoever found it would be able to identify the men he had served with. He said it was insurance against being forgotten. He looked at me directly. As it turned out, he was the one who survived, and he kept the numbers of the men he saved, I said. Yes, the general said. He carried them for 55 years. And I carried their names in my memory for the same length of time, waiting for a way to say them out loud to someone who deserved to hear them. I sat in that conference room for a long time after the general finished speaking. The folder remained on the table, closed. At some point I became aware that I had been pressing my palm flat against the table surface without knowing when I had started doing it. Outside the window, the installation went about its normal morning business. Vehicles moved. People walked between buildings. Everything was entirely ordinary. On the drive back to my own base, I did not turn on the radio. I kept both hands on the wheel and let the miles pass and thought about a 29-year-old man from Harlan County, Tennessee, sitting alone at a machine gun position on a hillside in the Central Highlands, holding a corridor open for 40 minutes so 11 other men could walk through it. I thought about my father's voice. He just stopped trying. I thought about my mother bringing casseroles twice a year. I thought about my brother's text message, keep me updated. That night I called my father and told him I needed to speak with him and my mother together. He said they were free on Sunday. I said I would be there. He asked what it was about. I said I would explain when I arrived. The careful silence on his end told me he recognized that this was not a routine call, but he did not press. In the days between that phone call and the Sunday drive to Knoxville, I did something that had not occurred to me until after the meeting with General Hargrove. I tried to find the other survivors. The general had given me the names that matched the service numbers on the pendant. 11 men. I was not a journalist or an investigator, but I was a Marine Corps officer with access to veterans networks, and with the kind of informal connections that military service builds over time. I reached out through those channels carefully, and without making any official inquiry that might require explanation. Within 10 days, I had located 4 of the 11 men who were still living. 3 were in their late 70s. 1 was 80. All 4 responded to my initial contact within the week. The first letter I received was from Thomas Greer, who lived in Lubbock, Texas, and had served in the Army for 20 years after Vietnam before retiring as a master sergeant. He was growing tomatoes now, he said, and irritating his grandchildren, and had been doing so contentedly for several years. His letter was 3 handwritten pages. He wrote that Bobby Mitchell was the reason he existed, and he wanted to be clear that he meant this not sentimentally, but as a straightforward statement of physical fact. He would not have walked out of those hills without him. He had thought about him every single day since November of 1967. He had named his first son Robert. He had never managed to tell Bobby Mitchell this because he had never managed to find him, and the gap between those two facts had been a source of quiet ache for decades. He closed by writing that if I was Bobby Mitchell's granddaughter, then I should know that the person I had lost was among the finest human beings he had ever encountered in his life. And he had encountered a good many. The second letter came from Curtis Webb in Savannah, Georgia, who had become a high school history teacher after leaving the Army and had spent 30 years teaching students about the Vietnam War. He wrote that he had taught the Battle of Dak to every year for 3 decades. He had never once told his students the specific story of the reconnaissance team and the choke point. He had felt, he wrote, that the story was not his to tell without permission from the man at the center of it. He wrote, "I kept thinking I would find him eventually. I kept thinking there would be a day when I could call him and ask if I could finally tell it. I am sorry that day did not come in time, but I am grateful to know there is someone who will tell it now." I kept those 2 letters and drove to Knoxville on Sunday with them in the passenger seat. My parents lived in the same house in West Knoxville, where I had grown up. The kitchen table where I had done homework and eaten 10,000 meals and heard Grandpa Bobby discussed as though he were a mild chronic problem that the family had collectively chosen to manage at a comfortable distance. My father sat across from me with his reading glasses on the table beside his coffee cup, which meant he was prepared for something serious. My mother sat to his left with her hands folded. They were both looking at me with the careful attention of people who have been told to expect something and are bracing accordingly. I placed Thomas Greer's letter on the table. I placed Curtis Webb's letter beside it. I placed the photograph from the cardboard box, the one of the young men laughing in front of the helicopter, on the table between us. Then I told them what had happened on the 19th of November 1967, on a hillside in the central highlands of Vietnam. I told them about the 12 men and the cut egress route and the damaged radio. I told them about the corridor through the enemy position and the approach point, and the decision Bobby Mitchell made when he was 29 years old, 6 years before my father was born. I told them about 40 minutes alone with a machine gun and 3 attempts to close the corridor and 11 men walking out of the hills while their team sergeant held the line. I told them about 7 months in a prisoner of war camp and a return home that was not celebrated and a decision, somewhere in the years that followed, to say nothing about any of it. My father did not speak for a long time. He picked up Thomas Greer's letter and read it through to the end. Then he set it down and picked it up and read the first paragraph again, slowly moving his lips slightly over certain phrases. I watched his face cycle through several expressions I had not seen on it before. Not grief exactly. Not yet. Something more complicated. The particular expression of a man watching a picture he has held for his entire life suddenly come into a focus that reveals it has always been something completely different from what he thought. My mother said he never told us. He had 50 years to tell us and he never said a word. I know, I said. Why? She asked. The word came out small and undefended in a way her words rarely did. I thought about what Bobby Mitchell had said in the hospital on the second day. I spent my whole life making sure certain things I had been part of did not damage the people around me. I thought about the General's words about 11 names in 55 years. I thought about what it means to carry something for half a century without putting it down, because the person he thought deserved to be remembered was not himself, I said. He thought the story belonged to the men who did not come home. He was the one who came home that disqualified him in his own accounting. My father looked down at the photograph. He studied the young men for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed in a way I had never heard before. It was smaller than his usual voice, and more careful, and something in it sounded like a man hearing himself clearly for the first time. Which one is him? He asked. I pointed. Second from the left. Grinning at something off. Camera squinting into the light. 20 into the light. 20. Some years old and not yet knowing what November would bring. My father looked at that young man for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were wet, which was something I had not seen from him since his mother's funeral 15 years earlier. "I thought he chose to disappear," my father said. "I thought he came back from the war and decided the regular world was beneath him somehow, or too difficult, or he just could not be bothered. I thought his silence was arrogance or damage. I thought he was a man who had given up. He was carrying 11 names," I said. "Every day." My father pressed his hand over his mouth for a moment and held it there. Then he said quietly, in a tone that had no performance in it, "I let him die alone. I did not say anything. There was nothing that would have helped." He already understood it. He had probably understood it since the phone call about the hospital, and had been holding it at a manageable distance with the normal mechanisms people use to avoid fully confronting the things they have done. The letters and the photograph and the story had removed the distance. It was no longer manageable. My mother had started crying quietly at some point during this, without reaching for a tissue. Just letting it happen. She said, "I thought I was being kind by not pushing him. I thought I was respecting that he did not want to talk about it. But I never once asked. I never sat with him and said, 'What was it like? What did you go through?' I was afraid the answer would be something I did not know how to hold." "So you held a casserole instead," I said, and immediately wished I had not said it that way. But she nodded. "Yes," she said, "something like that." We sat at that table for a long time. The coffee went cold outside. The Sunday neighborhood went about its business. After a while, my father asked me to tell him things that were not about the mission. What did Bobby eat for breakfast? What did he talk about on the porch? What did Chester look like? What did he say the morning I told him I was joining the Marines? I told him everything I could remember. It took a long time. My father listened with his reading glasses still on the table, and his hands folded and his eyes on the photograph. And he did not once look impatient or eager to move on to another subject. He just listened. A month later, my parents called and asked if we could hold a second service for Grandpa Bobby. Not a military ceremony, not a formal recognition with flags and speeches. Just a gathering of people who had known him, or had reason to want to say something about him. We held it on a Saturday afternoon at a small pavilion in the county park near his old house, the one whose backyard fence you could see from the road where he used to stand in the evenings with his coffee. Thomas Greer flew in from Lubbock. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, with white hair cut short, and a careful way of moving that suggested a body that had been asked a great deal from over a long life. Curtis Webb drove up from Savannah. Ray Dobbins, a third survivor, came from western Kentucky with his son, sat in the back row, and did not speak but nodded steadily at everything that was said. The nod of a man confirming a record he has been keeping privately for a long time. General Hargrove attended in civilian clothes and stood near the edge of the group with his hands clasped in front of him. Edna Colwell came, and several of the neighbors who had known Bobby Mitchell for decades, and had found him quiet and self-sufficient, and had respected him for it. The elderly man in the veteran's cap from the original funeral was there. His name was Harold Park. He had served in a different unit in the same general area in 1967, and had never met Bobby Mitchell personally, but he knew the name, he told me. In the veterans community, he said, certain names travel quietly for decades because the people who carry them never forget, even when the person behind the name has long since disappeared into ordinary life. My father stood at the front of the gathering and spoke. He said he owed everyone present an honest accounting. He said he had spent his adult life believing his father was a man who had come back from the war and retreated from the world, who had declined to engage with normal life and normal ambition, who had chosen smallness when something larger had been available. He said he had carried this belief as a verdict about his father's character, and had passed it along to his children, and had reinforced it every time his father. Silence seemed to confirm it. He said he understood now that he had been watching a man carrying something he could not put down and had mistaken the weight for weakness. He said, "I wish I had asked him one question about his life. Just one question. In 50 years, I think he would have found a way to answer it." Thomas Greer stood up after my father sat down. He spoke without notes and without a long preamble. He looked at my father and said that Robert Mitchell was the bravest man he had ever served with. Not because he was unafraid, he was afraid. You could see it, but because he was afraid and he stayed anyway. He said there were 11 men alive because of a decision one man made on a hillside in the dark, and that those 11 men had gone on to live lives of considerable variety and occasional significance, and that none of it would have happened without Bobby Mitchell holding a position alone for 40 minutes while the world tried to come through it. My mother was holding my father's hand by the time Greer sat down. Curtis Webb read from something he had written over the preceding weeks. He had spent 30 years waiting to write it down. He read a plain, careful account of the 19th of November, 1967. The kind of account that wants to be understood rather than admired. He read the 11 names at the end. He read them slowly, one at a time, each name its own sentence, each one given its own moment before the next one came. When the service was over, we walked to the grave together. My father knelt in the grass beside the headstone and stayed there for a long time. He did not speak. He did not need to. I stood a few feet back and held the pendant in my closed hand. I have thought a great deal about silence since that day. Not the silence of avoidance or withdrawal, which is what my family had always assumed Bobby Mitchell, as quietness was. The other kind. The kind that accumulates around something carried with full deliberateness. The silence of a man who knows exactly what he holds and has chosen not to diminish it by requiring other people to acknowledge it. My grandfather spent 50 years wearing 11 names against his chest and never once asked anyone to know about it. He lived in a small house and drove an old truck and kept a vegetable garden and fed a hound dog and was, by every visible measure, a man the world had quietly passed by. But Thomas Greer named his son Robert. Curtis Webb kept a story for 30 years waiting for permission to tell it. Ray Dobbins drove 4 hours to sit in a folding chair in a county park. General Hargrove had been carrying 11 numbers in his memory for 55 years. And Harold Park, who had never met the man, knew his name, because some names do not disappear no matter how quietly they are held. My family missed all of this. Not out of malice. Out of the particular blindness that comes from measuring a person exclusively by what they display. My parents are changed, in the way people change after being fundamentally corrected about something they held for a long time. My father visits the Veterans Center in Harlan County once a month. He does not go to be useful. He goes to listen. He sits with the old men who are still there and asks them questions and does not hurry the answers. My mother writes letters, real ones on paper, to veterans in the county who live alone. She found a list through a VA outreach program and mails something every week. Neither of them talks about it as if it is a form of penance, which it partly is. They talk about it as if it is something they should have been doing all along, which it also is. My brother came to the second service late, arriving after it had ended, and stood at the grave by himself for 15 minutes before anyone saw him. He has not said a great deal about it since, but a few weeks afterward he called me and asked me to tell him more about Grandpa Bobby. We were on the phone for 2 hours. He was quiet in the way people are quiet when they are listening carefully and understanding that they should have listened sooner. I still wear the pendant. I expect I always will. I went back to Harlan County last spring, on a Saturday in April when the county looked the way it looks in April, soft and green and reluctant to admit that winter had been long. I drove past the old house, which belongs to a young family now who have painted the porch a color Bobby Mitchell would not have chosen and put a tire swing in the yard, and seem to be making good use of the vegetable garden. I did not stop. I just looked at it from the road and thought about the man who had sat on that porch for 30 years watching the trees and the seasons, and the slow movement of an unhurried life, carrying something enormous and telling no one. Then I drove to the cemetery. I sat beside the grave for a long time. I talked to him the way I should have talked to him when he was alive, about nothing consequential, about the drive up and the color of the county in spring, and how Chester would have been useless in the car for 4 hours, and would have required 3 stops. About Thomas Greer's grandson, who was apparently considering the army, which Thomas Greer finds both gratifying and alarming. About the letters I still receive occasionally from veterans, who knew someone who knew the name Robert Mitchell. I told him I understood now what he meant when he said the pendant reminded him of the men who did not come home. I told him I thought he had spent 50 years reminding himself that his survival was not an accident but a responsibility, that he had lived on purpose, in the most complete sense of that phrase, and that the purpose had been the 11 men who walked out of those hills because he stayed. I told him that his family knew it now. All of us, imperfectly and too late, and with more regret than I can summarize cleanly. But we knew it, and we would not forget. The afternoon was ordinary and quiet. the way Harlan County afternoons tend to be. Wind in the old oaks at the cemetery edge. A bird calling twice from somewhere I could not see. The kind of day that asks nothing of you and offers nothing dramatic. Just the plain fact of being alive in a particular place at a particular time. I pressed my hand over the pendant and held it for a moment. I have been asked, since the second service, whether I am angry about what my family missed, whether I resent the years of dismissal, the holidays spent minimizing a man who had done something they would never fully comprehend, the casual jokes, the late arrivals and early departures, the flowers sent by text. I have thought about how to answer that honestly. I am not angry, that is the truth. I am something more like saddened by the ordinary human mechanism that produces this kind of missing. The mechanism that leads people to measure quietly, carried weight as nothing at all, because weight that is not displayed looks indistinguishable from nothing. The mechanism that produces a son who calls his father a man who gave up, when what he meant was a man who never performed for an audience. Most families have someone like Bobby Mitchell in them. Not necessarily a war hero. Not necessarily someone with a classified history and a pendant with 11 names. Just someone who carries their life with a quietness that gets mistaken for emptiness. Someone who does not interrupt the conversation to say what they have seen or done. Someone who sits at the edge of the holiday gathering and watches, and is glad to be there and never once demands that anyone notice. These are not passive people. They are people who have made a choice, whether consciously or not, to spend their energy on the thing itself rather than on the account of the thing. The world tends to undervalue this. The world is wrong. Ask the question before it is too late to receive the answer. Make the drive before there is no one at the end of it. Sit on the porch and drink the bad coffee and let the silence be what it is, which is not emptiness but fullness of a kind that cannot be hurried. Because the quietest people are often carrying the most. And the most important things they have to tell us are usually the things they will never think to say on their own. Thank you for listening.